Griot, part of the BRIDGEWORKS. Here's a question that should bother you. Why do European fairy tales follow African cosmological rules? Spirit spouses, who claim humans as lovers and punish betrayal across lifetimes. Animal-human transformations that are permanent and binding. Names that function as ontological keys. Know the true name. Hold the power. Curses that travel bloodlines, binding descendants to debts they didn't incur. Forests as sentient moral agents. Water as conscious, erotic, capable of desire and vengeance. Bargains that bind not just the individual but their children's children. European Christianity doesn't explain any of this. African cosmology does. Repeatedly. Across regions. Independently. So how did African narrative laws end up governing European fairy tales? The pattern that demands explanation. When the same mythic mechanics appear globally, but only one civilization treats them as foundational rather than aberrant, that civilization holds the deeper framework. This isn't about stolen plots. Most African tales were never archived, deliberately erased, fragmented, or dismissed as primitive folklore. We can't prove direct transmission for most stories, but we can trace structural DNA. European fairy tales are African-shaped stories retold inside non-African moral systems. They keep the transformation rules, the taboo structures, the spirit logic, but they lose the cosmology that explained those rules. They lose the ritual context. They lose the ontology that made spirits, ancestors, and nature co-equal actors. The question is, why does the structure survive when the worldview doesn't? What fable actually investigates? Fable isn't folklore collection. It's forensic reconstruction. Core questions. What narrative technologies allowed African instruction to survive when archives were destroyed? How did knowledge travel without writing, without institutions, without official sanction? Why do darker African logics, spirit debt, blood consequence, no happy endings, make stories more durable under pressure? What evidence exists that European tales inherited African mechanics even when African origins were erased? The evidence trail. African fables embed law, ethics, cosmology into narrative that can be remembered, retold, adapted without losing core logic. They teach through consequence, not explanation. They conceal instruction under allegory when direct teaching is dangerous. This wasn't ornament. This was survival technology. The Fable Griot score system. Here's where it gets architecturally interesting. Fable didn't work alone. It was one component of a three-part transmission system. The engineering problem. How do you preserve critical knowledge across time, centuries, millennia? Space. Forced migrations, displacements. Disruption. Wars, conquests, political collapse. Suppression. Deliberate destruction by hostile forces. The African solution. Fable equals encoding problem solved. Compress law, ethics, cosmology into memorable story form. Make it entertaining enough to retell but structured enough to preserve core logic. Griot equals transmission problem solved. Trained specialists whose authority derives from accuracy. Communal verification prevents corruption. Multiple lineages create redundancy. Kill one griot, others continue. Score equals durability problem solved. Embed knowledge in rhythm, chant, song. Put it in the body. When you can't carry books, you carry patterns. When writing is banned, rhythm persists. Remove anyone. The system fails. Fable without griot to corruption. No accuracy check. Griot without score, too vulnerable to forced migration. Knowledge dies with displacement. Score without fable to empty pattern, nothing to transmit. Together, complete knowledge architecture designed for catastrophic rupture. Why the darker logic matters. African fables lean into spirit spouses, revenge, witchcraft, possession, unresolved debt, refusal of neat endings. European collectors called this primitive or inappropriate for children. They missed the point entirely. African fables aren't comfort stories. They're instruction manuals for surviving a sentient universe. The darkness isn't cruelty, it's realism. In African cosmology, the world is not safe. Balance is not guaranteed. Survival requires knowledge of consequence. Actions bind descendants. Spirits have agency. Nature judges. This creates more durable instruction because fear is a better teacher than comfort. Consequences stick in memory. Unresolved endings demand interpretation. Engagement, not passive consumption. Moral ambiguity forces thinking. European fairy tales became nursery tales, sanitized, Christianized, morally closed. African fables remained adult instruction that children could access but not exhaust. That difference explains survival rates. The evidence question. What actually proves African structural ancestry? Not direct manuscript trails. Most don't exist. That's the point of erasure. But cosmological mechanics that only make sense within African worldviews. Narrative patterns that appear across African regions independently. Transformation rules that predate European contact. Spirit logic documented in African systems millennia before European folklore collection. Diaspora continuities. Same patterns surviving Atlantic crossing under conditions designed to destroy all cultural transmission. The Suriname test. When enslaved Africans in Suriname, Dutch colony, different colonial power, different geography, 400 years isolation, preserve identical narrative structures to West African originals. That's not coincidence. That's transmission working exactly as engineered. The investigative payoff. Understanding fable as investigative framework answers questions standard approaches can't. Why did African cultural practices survive enslavement when everything else was destroyed? Because knowledge was distributed across story, fable, custodians, griot, and rhythm, score. Attack 1. 2 others continue. How did specific knowledge travel without institutions? Through bodies? Through performance? Through redundant encoding? Why do African narrative patterns appear globally? Not because Africa invented all stories, but because African systems retained the cosmological architecture that makes certain narrative mechanics legible. What does this reveal about knowledge preservation under catastrophe? Centralized archives fail. Distributed, embodied, redundant systems survive. Why this matters now? We're living through institutional collapse, digital fragility, algorithmic misinformation. Archives disappear. Truth fragments. The Fable Griot score system offers proven alternatives. Knowledge encoded in story survives without centralized authority. Verified by community, not dependent on single institution. Embodied in practice, can't be deleted, banned, or burned. This isn't nostalgia. This is blueprint for resilience when permanence can't be guaranteed. African fable doesn't just preserve stories. It preserves the laws of how knowledge survives when systems designed to protect it fail. And those laws are still working. In the patterns we recognize, the stories that stick, the truths we carry without knowing why. The BRIDGEWORKS is an original civilizational framework developed by Chinenye Egbuna Ikwemesi within Afrodeities.